Hi, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining our Industry Insights webinar today on how understanding workflows can lead to better adoption. My name is Allison Kim, and I'm the marketing coordinator here at Litera Microsystems. Before I let our guests, Matt James and Judi Flournoy, take over, I just want to run through a few housekeeping items for today. The webinar will run for 30 minutes. At the end, there will be time for a Q&A session. At any time, if you have any questions throughout the webinar, submit them in the chat box panel, and we will try to make sure we get to them within our time frame. If not, we will send a follow-up afterwards. In addition to everyone who is here today, and for those who cannot make it, you will also receive a recording for you to share and to have on record. With that said, Matt, take it away.
Great, thank you, Allison. So for brief introductions, I'll let Judi here go first and introduce herself, and then we'll step into the agenda as likely that you saw as you signed up for today. So Judi, if you don't mind, could you take a moment to give the audience an introduction?
Sure, happy to do that, Matt. And hello, everyone. Glad to have you join us today for our chat. I'm the Chief Information Officer for Kelley Drye Warren. We're headquartered in New York City, considered a national firm in the AmLaw 250. I've been doing this for a bit of time, been a CIO now for the better part of 20 plus years for a couple of different firms, and passionate about a number of things, including peer networking, sharing of information, and education. So I'm happy to be on the call today and looking forward to the conversation.
Great, thank you. And for those of you who don't know me, my name is Matt James. I overlook our pre-sales engineering team, which are really our subject matter experts in our portfolio, as well as our evangelism team, which focuses heavily on thought leadership in the legal space, often challenging status quo, as you may know, and information gathering with individuals like Judi as we do local market events and visit our customer base. Today, from an agenda perspective, as I mentioned, you had probably seen at the sign-up page that we offered, we really want to take a look into people, process, and technology. And we'll definitely give people and process its due in the beginning of the presentation, and then as a software vendor, we obviously want to be able to talk about technology towards the end. So we'll discuss legal innovation and design thinking. We'll step through work stream of lawyers and how to look at technology versus the traditional tech stack, as I like to call it. Some items that don't tend to jump, I think, front and center to mind when we think about the use. So clicking, branding, and how some complexities can discourage actual use. When to train versus when to arm the individuals with technology, or easy buttons in this sense. And then I think it's really important that as we talk about innovation and technology, that we also take into consideration the adoption and what it takes to accomplish that through training. So before we get into any of the technology focus, in conversations with Judi, and even more of that has demonstrated itself as I've traveled over the last month, I've had some really good criticism that was provided back, very constructive, around how technology providers and software vendors are always thinking technology first, but that's not always the case when it comes to innovation, and that often could be the last consideration. In fact, I was just with a firm in Miami who let me know that 4 out of 5 scenarios tend to be a process problem that can be resolved, as opposed to technology solving that problem. So Judi, as we kind of approach this in somewhat of an interview type of theme, maybe you could speak to this graphic, which I found on LinkedIn in a legal community. Do you see these as chronological steps to innovation? Do one of these groups need to happen before the other? Or are these initiatives that are progressing in parallel? And how often do you see these as maybe cross-departmental projects, or these kind of siloed in particular groups?
So Matt, I don't see this so much as chronological. I certainly think there's a logic to the approach. Obviously, you can't solve a problem if you don't know what it is. And to know the problem you're solving requires what I would characterize as the basic tenet of design thinking, which is empathy. So if I were asking the question, this could be characterized as a user-centered approach. If you were looking at the graphic that you shared with the audience, I would start there, but I would go a direct line from user-centered approach to customer journey mapping, which is really what I would characterize as sort of that empathy process of understanding what the problem is or the problem you're trying to solve. There's been, there has to be ownership. Many projects do, in fact, cross departments. For example, a good one would be a CRM, if you will, a customer relationship management program. Oftentimes has to cross over many departments for understanding of how it will be used and how it's deployed. But that then takes you to the other steps that are involved, which is the research, feedback, and visualization. So I would go from customer journey mapping to that, and then that would take me directly to used by clients, and then used by lawyers, and then the process management component of that. Another example would be an implementation of a document management system, because that touches everyone, including your external audience, your clients. So I think it's good to understand where these pieces and parts come together, but it's extraordinarily important to start with the first question, which is, what problem am I trying to solve, and who do I need to have the conversation with?
I think that's great, and you had mentioned this concept of design thinking, and really how there's the empathy element, which is the initial piece that you had spoke to. Does this relate to what we often hear around the people, process, and technology motto? And could you maybe introduce this topic to the audience for those who may not be familiar with it, and even if an example of how Kelley Drye has leveraged design thinking inside of your law firm?
So generally, design thinking has been used since its inception to respond to changing trends. And more recently, in the last few years, it's probably most prominently known as part of the curriculum at Stanford's D School, or School of Design. What fundamentally design thinking does is it goes back to what I mentioned a moment ago about sort of this empathy process. So empathizing with the individual or individuals around what the pain point is, having what we could typically call an empathy interview. That might start with a conversation, might start with a survey. And then if there's a survey, there might be a follow-up to the survey where there then is a conversation. So you're teasing out of the respondent more detailed information about what their pain points are around a particular process. Then defining, if you will, what that problem is, sort of elaborating on what that is, and then putting together ideas, working together as a team, whether that's with the original submitter who responded to your survey or your original question, and then take that to the team and come together with some ideas about how one might approach that problem. You've seen a lot of that around, I think, knowledge management professionals, where throughout the course of KM and law firms have really tried to understand how information is used and shared and how to best get people to that information. So basically taking that and prototyping a system that might actually functionally do what it needs to be done, testing that with your audience, if you will, with the stakeholders, and then hopefully you've hit your mark and you roll it out. But to some extent, I think as an industry, we've always done this on some level. What I think is different now for us at Kelley Drye is we are what I will characterize as institutionalizing this into the work that we do with the practice areas. So what we've done recently within the last couple of years is we stood up what I would characterize as an innovation lab. We called it Katie Skunk Works, and we used design thinking in an effort in 2018 to look at different areas and different practices in terms of what were the pain points, what were they dealing with that just seemed extraordinary levels of effort that weren't particularly productive and or profitable, if you will. And out of that exercise came essentially a project. That project will now go live shortly, and that will not only reduce a tremendous amount of administrative overhead around a particular function in our bankruptcy department, but will also increase the realization rate of the attorneys involved in that process. So they're not doing a lot of administrative work, which is what they were doing previously. So taking you back to the empathy component, it was asking the question, what is the pain point that you're dealing with? And then how, going through the process of definition, having some ideas about how to address it. So that's really what design thinking is. And again, I think that we've been doing this on some level, but perhaps not quite as organized or well-defined as we do it today. So that's certainly something I think has affected us as a firm. And we're seeing this where The technology that's in use by firms is driven not just by IT, but it needs to be driven by the practicing lawyers, right? And the other professionals that are working on behalf of the firm's clients. So getting them engaged in the conversation is extraordinarily important, whereas historically, I think a lot of what we did in IT is we pushed to the audience the technology we thought made sense without a lot of consideration for what they thought.
Yeah, and that's a great point. We see that all the time, and I think that's what's put us in this state where there's such a concern around the adoption because of the lack of success we've had where IT's been pushing that. And as you explained it here, it really helps resonate on some of that feedback that I had spoken to where, I think vendors, and I've said this in multiple webinars if people have been a part of it, I think the term vendor has often had this negative connotation because it is this concept of just pushing technology when you haven't gone through these appropriate stages and you haven't questioned the individual around what the problem truly is. But moving into that business partnership where you can really help understand what the problem is, help expose some of that, and then find that maybe technology is the solution in that particular case. So if we take that assumption that you've gone through your design thinking, and as you mentioned, this project with your bankruptcy, let's say that technology was the conclusion. Technology would solve this problem. Of course, we could enhance some of the process that we have, but technology is what we're going to need in order to do so. How do you look at that in a sense of that traditional mindset that you had mentioned, where we push something and we kind of look at the left-hand side here, where there's this linear tech stack, and we think about where a product plays at each of those exit points and so forth, versus looking at and problem solving almost this design on the right-hand side where we know individuals work in this particular way. In my experience, what I often find is that we try to have this conversation around value, but value tends to just be a pricing conversation. And my challenge is trying to understand how we can actually have a conversation around pricing and putting value to technology if we're looking at it from the left-hand perspective as opposed to the right-hand perspective. So I'm interested in, as you look to bring technology into the firm and as you go through this, how important do you see it to be the viewpoint on the right-hand side as opposed to the left-hand side? And do you still see, this traditional view on the left-hand side of this is what our tech stack is from a line item perspective, it's still to be very prevalent?
So if I'm looking at it from the consumer perspective, and so when I say that, I mean I'm the purchaser of software, I'm looking at it on the left-hand side. I'm looking at the stack, right? But I think in some respects, I think we have to retrain the way we think about technology services. To your point, a product may be one layer in a fairly complex array of software and features. So if you're looking at that stack and you're looking at your graphic here, you're talking about a variety of things in the process, right, where attorneys are doing the work that they need to do, whether they're creating, they're collaborating, or they're checking. And then you look to the left, and you're saying, but those are all the pieces and parts that make what's happening on the right side of the screen, if you will, happen. To that extent, I think what we've done previously is we've worked hard to fit those pieces together without much thought for how and when and why those tools are actually used. And I think that's what's changing. Now we ask why and when, and try to understand really not so much can you use a piece of software? It's why would you use it? When would you use it? How would you use it? And then trying to understand that audience perspective instead of pushing to them, well, we think that this piece of software makes the most sense to you. It's understanding from their perspective what the right tool is in that moment in time. That, I think, is a significant change.
And I see that as great insight, right? And that also helps us, in my opinion, determine and define what success is. So if we understand when and how and why someone is using something, maybe we can move away from the expectations of a usage rate that is just unrealistic, right? So I think that can help drive a lot of defining success and ensuring that the firm is finding their investment in that technology that they've obviously applied to the problem that they're looking to solve.
And I Judi, think that's the dilemma, Matt, for a moment, if I'm going to jump in for 1 second. I think that's
Please.
Part of the dilemma for software developers and resellers of software, such as Litera, is that you obviously have to have a revenue stream, right? So you're driving toward selling a product into law firms and or law departments, and the software itself is there to solve a problem. What I think is happening now on the other side of the house, whether it's inside a law department or it's inside of a law firm, is a more critical analysis of how these tools are actually being used. Where historically firms would perhaps purchase an enterprise agreement, we are now looking at different pieces of software and saying, does it really make sense for DocX tools, as an example, to be deployed across my entire enterprise? What's the percentage of use of that particular piece of software? So I think we're doing more critical analysis as law firms to really understand how things are being used and then translate to what we're really purchasing.
Yeah, and it really gives a good insight into maybe the quality of usage as opposed to the quantity of usage as well. A great point. As we continue on, and I know, Judi, you're familiar with this because you've been quoted in it in the past. And for those of you on the line who haven't heard of it, we have an annual publication called The Changing Lawyer. And this stat at the top here came from individuals that contributed to those on a market research, which were that 69% of firms did not feel that their current technology stack was optimized for innovation. And as we dug deeper into it, it was really around trying to uniquely identify yourself or your practice or your firm from others. And as we know, innovation in legal hasn't been as fast moving as other verticals, and often that's because firms aren't making the leap until they know someone else has done that, and we can understand why we attempt to mitigate the risk. But we also found in some of the stats that we had driven that almost 50% of firms found that they had 11 or more applications living in Office, right? So Outlook and Word, and that 82% of those firms admitted that there was a variety of overlap. So as you do this research that you even spoke to about on the last slide, Judi, how much of that do you think about the overlap of technology, what you currently have versus what you bring in? And then that top portion here as asking is, do you consider if technology is disruptive from a way the provider brands things or the amount of clicks that it takes to accomplish those workflows the lawyers are facing on a daily basis?
Sure. So I think the first thing I would say is most people will take the path of least resistance. And so if the tech stack is not optimized, meaning it's not easy to use, easy to understand, people will find an easier way to get the work done. And I think this is part of the dilemma that we face, is we understand that there are tools that could fundamentally make things easier, but if it requires time to learn it, if it requires time to understand how and when to use it, then you're very difficult to get someone who's already pressed for time, right? Attorneys obviously are on the clock, and their primary focus is client service and getting the work done on behalf of the client. So I think what we need to be doing as an industry, and I think some of this is already happening, in addition to sort of understanding, as I mentioned earlier on, sort of how, why, when, is how to make it easier, like having an easy button, which is sort of the only way to think about that, I think, is making it easier for people to use the tools that are available to them and have it be easy for them to understand how, why, when they would use them. So the fewer clicks you have, that makes it obviously easier for the staff or other professional to think about what they need to do and when they need to do it. In other words, reducing the amount of friction involved in getting the work done. Because as I said before, the average person will take the path of least resistance. They will look for the easy way. And we have this tremendous toolkit in our environments, whether we're using the Litera stack or we're using a competitor stack, we have tremendous tools. But if you were to talk to the majority of your population, particularly attorneys, and this goes back to this concept of the digital native, we think that digital natives, a particular generation of attorneys, should be able to easily adapt to and use these tools. That's not necessarily the case. Why? Because digital native doesn't necessarily translate to using the business tools that would have been created for our industry, because they may not actually be as intuitive as one might think they are. Think iPhone. I mean, the biggest disruptor in the market, in mobile market and in application market and in just usability has been the iPhone. It's turned the world upside down. Why? Because it's extraordinarily easy to use. It has an easy to understand user interface. So I think the potential impact of productivity really depends upon how easy it is for people to understand and use the software. And the biggest piece of that then ties back to this how, when, why question.
And I think the iPhone element of that is a great example. I've often referred to, and part of the reason we're showing the ribbon here, that transferable skill set, right? So you learn one thing on the iPhone and it's applicable to all the apps that you download. You don't go through a training each and every time that you receive something new, because you can take those transferable skills. So part of this bottom piece here, I wanted to make sure I alluded to, the goal for us is to try to provide our technology in a simple, intuitive location that provides that path of transferable skills, so that the digital native may be willing to embrace these, because there's a little amount of friction. Judi, you had mentioned an easy button, and I think that's something that we have found where there's been a heavy shift in training, and we'll kind of jump into that a little bit more. And there's some of the reasons on the right-hand side that's come into play. But when you go through process design and when you identify that there are needs that can be resolved through process and technology, or maybe let's say just process, is there ever a tipping point where you recognize that technology can do this faster and better, even if we trained our users or gave them a great process at doing so?
So I think the first thing we have to understand is that training inherently is not necessarily the thing that most people embrace. Most adult learners, if they are subject matter experts, as most lawyers are, can be resistant to admitting when they don't know something. So that's the first sort of piece that you have to deal with, is the audience willingness to learn something new, to devoting the time to do that. So with respect to our training team, over the last several years, we've been working towards changing the way that training is delivered or learning opportunities are provided, whether that's one-to-one. So our training team offers one-to-one sessions with attorneys at every level, so that if an attorney wants to learn something very specific about how to do something, like run a table of authorities, the trainer will go and spend 15 minutes with that attorney and show them how to run a table of authorities in their document. That's a very different model from what we had been doing historically, which was really around classroom training, getting a group of people into a room, having an instructor at the front of the room. If it was a large enough room, you might have a second person sort of watching the back of the room to make sure people were keeping up with the curriculum. So that's a very different model now, and I think that's a good indication of our now evolving understanding of how people would prefer to learn in sort of at their own pace and in their own time, whether they're doing it via a webinar, again, using a one-to-one opportunity, or leveraging components of a learning management system where it's more just-in-time learning. I want to know how to, right? So those are things I think that are extraordinarily important, but it also goes back to this idea that making the software and or system and or service as easy and as intuitive as we can, so that we don't have to provide a lot of training. That's really the key in my mind. Again, going back to this idea of the iPhone, the easier we can make it for people to use the software, then they can ultimately be more efficient without you telling them that they're not being efficient now, which can be pretty shaky ground if you go down that path. So the goal would be make it easier so they can be more efficient without you sort of somehow inferring that they're not currently being efficient.
Yeah, that's a great point, especially as you bring up the sense of the one-to-one versus the classroom training. We've seen, just knowing through our experiences, that classroom trainings often had a lack of attendance, or we found that the individuals in that audience had a variety of needs and skills and experience with those technologies, that even if you spent that half hour in the room, you may have only gotten the 5 to 10 minutes of what you were looking to gain. So being able to do it kind of at a just in time, I think, is great. I do have one additional question to this piece, and then we'll kind of go on to another training element. But where do you really see the line drawn for self-sufficiency versus the reliance on support staff? So as you had talked about some of the folks who have been in the firm for a variety of years and obviously have established successful practices, do you ever see the desire to push self-sufficiency on those folks, or do you see that as really being more of a new breed that's coming up through the firm?
I think honestly it depends on the individual. I think that I have some what I would characterize as more senior attorneys who have been practicing for a long time, who embrace some of the newer technologies or tools if they find them to be beneficial in their practice. But realistically, in most firms, I think this is a broad but fair statement, in most firms, people that are in a senior position aren't doing the actual work. It is typically the more junior attorneys that are doing the heavy lifting on generating the documents and doing the research. And so it's that audience that we try to focus on, and not expecting our more senior partners, as an example, to, if you will, adopt newer technologies. That said, when we rolled out our new document management system, NetDocuments, in 2018, we had mandatory training for everyone. And the reason why we did that is we understood that it was such a significant change from what we had previously had in the environment that we felt it was important to take people's time in a classroom setting. And that was mandatory, and it was enforced, and it was supported by firm leadership. But that is so rare anymore to need to do that, because most everything else is more iterative. As we go through every version of Windows and Office, the changes are fundamentally minimal, such that training in the classroom setting really isn't required. But again, going back to this idea where providing training at that moment in time and or providing tools where the individual can consume learning opportunities at their own pace, I think is even more important today than it's ever been.
Yeah, and as you say that too, and maybe this is a topic for another day and another time, the challenge then, what we often see is, if those folks who are the junior are doing the majority of the work, how do you also get the buy-in from the more senior individuals who may not be doing that on a day-to-day basis? The last slide that we kind of moved into here was, and we had already, I think, kind of gotten into this a bit, but when do you train versus, again, when do you just provide an intuitive button? And you had spoke to some of those. I think the piece here for me becomes, do you find the above to be accurate, in the sense that what we've started to do with our training, because to some extent it's bag diving for us when someone says, what is your training department like, as we can provide a variety of different answers, but it's also, meant to align with the culture. We've started to work down this concept of storyboards and short little videos. I'm interested in hearing from you if that's also, besides the one-to-one touch points that you've had, if you've seen success in storyboards, short videos, in product training material that kind of falls into that just in time that you had mentioned.
We certainly have, and a lot of the training materials that we provide now are fundamentally like storyboards and or short videos. Again, going back to this idea that getting people into a classroom setting is nearly impossible and not a real good use of their time. And this goes back also to this idea of, I need to know how to do this thing in this moment, because this is the particular task I'm assigned to complete, and I need a particular tool to do that. And so I need to know how to use that tool in this moment in time. And so being able to provide those kinds of learning opportunities gets people to where they need to be more quickly, and also reduces, if you will, on some level, reliance on the staff. I mean, since I've been doing this, the ratios of support staff to attorneys have gone down, dramatically through the years. We have more attorneys who are self-sufficient than ever before. Fewer support staff provide support to them. And so I think that's a trend that's not going to stop. And I think that the easier we make it for people to use what's available to them, the better, obviously, in terms of their productivity and the overall profitability of the firm.
Absolutely. And I really think that this also puts a heavy focus on solving the problem at hand, which ties all the way back to the empathy approach that you said, which is, yes, someone may need to generate a TOA, but they may have a challenge at doing it and accomplishing it right now, and being able to be clear and concise on how to accomplish that task does have that little bit of a focus on the pain that they're receiving. Judi, I know we're running up to the top of the hour here. There were a few questions that came in. So I'm going to ask Allison to quickly read those off, and I'll give you first swing at those. I do just quickly want to mention we do have another webinar coming up, which is helping out with some of the mid-sized law firms that traditionally have had the mindset that we have the same problem as large law firms, but maybe don't have the budget to be able to address that, and trying to eliminate some of those fallacies. But I'm going to hand this over to Allison to ask these questions. And as I said, Judi, I'll give you the first go, and we greatly appreciate all of the insight that you've provided along the way.
All right, thank you, Matt. Our first question comes from Mark. I've heard of a variety of firms requiring lawyers to be a stakeholder in any new technology projects, with IT supporting them. Have you considered this approach, or do you see this best suited to still be driven by IT?
Great question. So I'll respond to that. We actually, at the conclusion of our innovation lab, as I mentioned early on in the conversation, Katie Skunkworks, that fundamentally drove, I think, some internal thinking around what the firm needs to be doing with respect to innovation. So we now have a partner in charge of technology, and we also have a client services and innovation committee, and that's chaired by another partner. So there's definitely recognition internal to the firm that we need to have partners as stakeholders, and then identifying individuals who would best be suited in those roles. And I think that's the right direction for our firm, and I imagine that other firms are already doing that, and maybe some firms are thinking about doing that, but I certainly think it makes sense.
Great, couldn't agree more. I think we had one more.
Yep, our final question comes from Anne. Have you seen a growth in roles of process design and or innovation lawyers within legal or your law firm?
So going back to my prior answer, the partner I mentioned, who now is the partner in charge of technology, how he arrived at that role was he's a real estate attorney and identified a lot of pain points in the practice area. He came from a computer background. He'd been a software developer, had been in a part of a software development company before getting his degree in practicing. And he essentially developed, working with some outside developers, developed a program that would make the process for the work that they do, streamline that process and automate a lot of it. And he brought that then to the firm, and that is now embedded inside of our firm, and we're now in process of embedding that with our clients. So to the question, I think that there are certain people internal to your organizations who may be well suited to this. One of the things I did when I established the Innovation Lab in 2017, 2018, was I asked different attorneys at different levels in different practice areas in different offices to participate based upon what I knew about them. And what I did was, literally, I did research on every one of my attorneys about whether or not they had a computer science undergrad, or mathematics, or had they somehow expressed some kind of interest in technology. And so I looked for people who would be well suited for that. So if you're considering trying to put together a team, do a little bit of the research, understand what people have in their backgrounds. You might be surprised how many of them actually have a technical background or might be well suited for that kind of work.
Yeah, and we'll end it on this, or expand on that. From our experience, we've seen that those individuals are the ones who've really committed to the project. They're easy to work with. We don't find that there's a lot of resources that go into a project for no result. Right? We find people who can commit time to it, and then it's also alleviated some of the pressures on IT of trying to identify the squeaky wheels and who's serious about something and who may just be throwing something over to IT to kind of vet out. So I know we went a few minutes over. We greatly appreciate you joining us, Judi. I think that your insight is invaluable, and I appreciate you providing the majority of the answers to those questions and the topics that we brought up. For the rest of you on the call, we also appreciate you joining. Any information that you need in regards to our social media is found right here. We wish you all a great day and appreciate and thank you for joining. And again, special thank you to you, Judi.
My pleasure. And to those who are on the call today, if anyone has any questions about what we did with our Skunkworks, feel free to reach out to me directly. Have a great afternoon, everyone.
Thank you.
Awesome. Bye.